college and the alumni network, which is very, very essential for the overall improvement of the college. And they can help us in many ways in reaching to different sectors and areas. So I would be very happy if they are present and if they could introduce themselves right now. Or if they are not so, I can have a brief about them.
Kashif Mansoor is joined from Center for Development Studies. He's here. Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, ma'am. Good morning, ma'am.
Hello.
This is Kashif Mansoor, and I did my graduation in the year 2010 to 13.
Okay.
In the batch 2010 to 13. And I'm very fortunate. I mean, I'm feeling very happy that I'm becoming a part of this symposium and colloquium where I would be presenting my paper. And thanks especially to my teacher, I mean, Krishna Kumar sir. He was very encouraging, and even at this moment also he's very encouraging. I'm really thankful. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
We are proud of you and welcome once again. We are proud of you.
Ma'am, the other person will be joining from Toronto at 11 a.m. only.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, no issue. It has been very well planned. It starts with a book discussion and by research presentations, followed by an article for discussion. And then we have other two research presentations as per the schedule shared by Krishna Kumarji. What I would suggest is each topic is a big theme in its own way. I think you can have one day deliberations on each of these topics. The topics which have been listed under research presentation, very interesting, like spatial inequalities in big cities. It's really a matter of good research area and a matter of concern also. And regarding the son preference, resource concentration, and the gender gaps in education, and the economic approach to law, and regarding the minimum wages compliance and labor market discrimination in a Delhi slum. Hope this particular thing, labor market discrimination in a Delhi slum, is an empirical study, and all the issues listed out are very important, and they need a discussion or a deliberation. Each needs a discussion or a deliberation, which may have, for which you can spare 1 or 2 days. You may think it over. And also, I am glad to know that the department has been quite active. It has been organizing event like this even in the past during the pandemic, and especially the online research internship program, that is Shri Vipra for students, and wherein more than 40 students of the department were part of various research projects. This is very important because they should have insights into research during their graduation, which will help them to take up the similar such assignments in future. And also happy to note that 5 of the members of the faculty of the department were mentors in various projects under the scheme. So with this, I am very happy that today you are organizing this research colloquium on contemporary issues in economic theory and policy. Theory and policy are such areas where we need to have continued discussions, and which is dynamic and which is always evolving. So certainly I do hope that this research colloquium will be very fruitful, and the participants would gain insights, deeper insights on the topics highlighted in the schedule, and you will have good deliberations during the entire day. And I do hope that all the participants be interactive in this event, and not just silent what you call listeners or spectators. So with this, once again, I convey my best wishes to the entire department and the teacher in charge, Krishna Kumar, for taking the lead in organizing this very important event on a very topical theme. And as I told you, there's a lot to discuss on all the issues, as there are no concrete solutions to many concerns and problems which we are facing day to day. So hope we come out with some good suggestions by the end of the day. Maybe Krishna Kumar ji can share a brief about the event so that we can have some real good inputs on the topics highlighted. So with this, once again, my best wishes and my compliments to all the faculty in the departments for initiating this event. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. This event is largely curated and organized. To a very large extent, the back-end support has been from the part of students. And throughout the event, the sequence of the events will be done by the General Secretary of the Economic Society, Sanya Behel. So Sanya Behel will be announcing the sequence of all the events. Over to Sanya.
Thank you, sir. Welcome all to our research colloquium. I would like to invite Dr. Krishna Kumar, sir, to give an introduction to the conference. Over to you, sir.
Largely the content of the current conference, Dr. C. Sheila Reddy has already given a large outline about the content of this particular conference. Most importantly, it's a great get-together of researchers who are there in various colleges of the University of Delhi, as well as because of this pandemic, students and researchers from different other universities and also from abroad, we are able to get some people. It's a good start from our side. But most importantly, we have always this question: is research possible in an undergraduate institution? And under the coming 4-year system, I think it is going to be not just a possibility; it is going to be a reality. So I think might be these are the initial steps of ours in this regard. When I contacted the students who had passed out of our college, there was immense response that I had to say no to some of the students because otherwise the program would have gone far longer. So we might have another small session where one of the students have agreed to do a workshop on survey design, and she's working with the Jameel Poverty Action Lab. Of course, she's based in Delhi. And another from Houston has also agreed to present. Some other people from outside, because of time zone differences, could not be accommodated. But we look forward for other little sessions like this in future. And I'm very happy that our own principal, Professor C. Sheila Reddy, is also there, and all full support of all my department colleagues has been there. They've kindly agreed to be chairing sessions, discussing, and also presenting papers in this particular meeting. I think I should not stand between them and the students who are eagerly waiting to hear from them. So may I just stop here so that we proceed to the next session. And best for everybody, and thanks for everybody for turning up and accepting the invitation of our college. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So we're going to start the session with a book discussion on the book titled Mostly Harmless Econometrics. I would like to, so the session will be chaired by Dr. M. Padma Suresh. I would like to invite Sejal Makhija, the treasurer of the Economic Society, to introduce the panelists. Sejal, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. To begin with the book discussion, we have Dr. Lokendra Kumawat, who is currently serving as the Assistant Professor of Economics at Ramjas College, University of Delhi. His areas of expertise are in applied econometrics, macroeconomics, and time series econometrics. He has participated and presented various papers at national and international conferences. He has also been associated with various faculty enrichment programs. His current research is based on the monetary policy of India. Talking about Dr. Naveen Joseph Thomas, he has completed his PhD from Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. His areas of research are in home economics, growth theory, labor economics, and the issues of MSME sector. His current research focuses on the education choices of parents constrained by the funding of, his current research focuses on the analysis of education choice of parents in rural areas using the ASER data set. He has also served as the Assistant Professor of Economics at Jesus and Mary's College, University of Delhi for 7 years. I may now request Dr. M. Padma Suresh, Associate Professor of Economics, to chair the session.
Yeah, thank you. And good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to the panelists for the book discussion, Dr. Lokendra Kumawat and Dr. Naveen Thomas. It's a real pleasure to have you with us in this forum. So Dr. Kumawat and Dr. Thomas will be discussing the book, Mostly Harmless Econometrics, an empiricist companion, published by Princeton University Press in 2009 and authored by Joshua Ankrist and Steve Pischke. The book is no doubt an exceptional contribution to the practice of applied econometrics. And in their book and their approach, the authors focus on real empirical questions, actual causal questions that are interesting, that are important, and also matter because they concern contemporary public policy issues. In 2018, Chicago Booth's Eugene Fama Prize for Outstanding Contribution to Doctoral Education in General Economics and Finance was awarded to Ankrist and Pischke for this book, Mostly Harmless Econometrics. So this book is now used as a supplementary reference book for graduate level teaching, that is master's and PhD level teaching, for courses in applied econometrics as well as empirical microeconomics in many universities. A little about the authors, Ankrist and Pischke. They are professors at MIT and LSE respectively. They met as PhD students at Princeton University in the late 1980s and both taught at MIT in the mid-1990s. The book, in fact, grew out of the applied econometrics course they taught at MIT. I think substantially, in the last 3 decades, applied econometrics has evolved substantially from the time, at least, I was a student. And the emphasis is a lot now on estimation of specific causal effects, measuring consequences of changes in economic policy. This has gained a lot of traction among applied econometrics researchers, including labor economists, Ankrist and Pischke themselves being also labor economists. And what would be interesting here from the book discussion today, the book itself, I think the authors have a very unique style of writing. And also, I think some little comment from the author, the panelists on what is meant by harmless econometrics, right? Taking the con out of econometrics, is that what is implied here? And also for me, what is perhaps very interesting is the approach which is given in the book, Mostly Harmless Econometrics, as well as their mastering metrics, the path from cause to effect, which came out in 2014, again, Princeton University Press, and which is perhaps more relevant for undergraduate teaching. Right. What would be interesting to know is, since both Dr. Thomas and Dr. Kumawat are also teachers of applied econometrics here, the adoption of these textbooks, maybe mastering metrics in the undergraduate teaching, what kind of difference would it mean? Is it really going to be a paradigm shift in pedagogy of applied econometrics teaching? This approach, which is concentrating on establishing causal links, on measuring the impact of policy changes, how is it different from the traditional old style econometrics that we have all learned, and at least I have learned, right? Are we only interested in measuring causal effects here, not in explaining economic variables, which is what we have always done traditionally? And also, what are the tools that are used in this kind of econometric tools? What are the econometric methods? What is estimation in this approach here? How do we do inference in this approach? And how is it different from our traditional econometrics here? I think in trying to understand or establish causal, links here, there has been a significant use of RCTs here, which provide rigorous answers, convincing answers to causal questions. And where we do not use RCTs, I think Ankrist and Pishke believe in letting the data speak. Right? So using the data here, the data sets that we have, is it possible to construct a natural experiment or a quasi-experiment here and to infer causality from this? Right? So that seems very different from the traditional modeling that we do. We are building a regression model. It's a very different approach here. So I'm sure that Dr. Kumawat and Dr. Thomas, as they take us through the book, the book has 8 chapters divided into 3 sections, which has a preliminaries, core, and also extensions. As they guide us through the book, I'm sure they'll provide interesting insights into the learning and teaching of econometrics, which uses these approaches. Also, one particular issue that interested me is in trying to establish this kind of causal effects here, is the emphasis a lot on the use of instrumental variables here, especially in the context of omitted variable bias, right? And how difficult is it to come up with instrumental variables in different contexts, right? I think many empirical studies, including Ankrist themselves, have come up with very clever, ingenious instrumental variables. But in many contexts, it may not be possible to come up with such instruments. So what is the role of instrumental variables here? And I now request Dr. Kumawat and Dr. Thomas now to take us and guide us through the contents of the book.
Thank you, Dr. Padma, and thank you, the Department of Economics, Venkateswara College, for inviting me here and giving an opportunity to interact with the students and faculty here. Of course, I'm here because Dr. Krishna Kumar called me 10 days back and said, Lokendra, we are organizing a conference, and I just want to hear whether you want to present a paper or discuss a book. So I think I didn't have an option C. So I chose one of them for the reason that my area of research, as you know, is such that, and of course, the paper that I'm working on currently, I thought maybe it's better not to present it here in an undergraduate college event. I think it should be more interesting to the students of second year and third year, as Dr. Krishna Kumar told me, so that we can add some value to their understanding. So thank you for this. And now coming to this book, as Dr. Padma said, rightly said, this is written by 2 labor economists. And of course, I am not a labor economist at all. In fact, even if we talk about data, if we talk about data type, labor economists mostly relies on sample data, sample cross-section data. So I would look at, before I come to the theme of this book, I would look at it in, look at 2 particular aspects of this book. One, the harmlessness that this book highlights, and I think that is really a very good attribute of this book. So even if you are not a labor economist, I think as a teacher of student at undergrad level, it does provide you with an approach that is missing in most textbooks these days, which on one hand leaves the discussion of econometrics incomplete, I would say, in some sense, except for books such as the book by Jeffrey Wooldridge. On the other hand, it also, as the authors rightly point out in the preface, tend to do a lot of harm. And this harm is clear in the discussion that we have with the students. So for instance, I'm told in Sri Venkateswara College, a good percentage of students opt for advanced course in econometrics. But I think if you look at an average institution or an institution in general, the proportion of students who opt for such courses is not very high. In my own college, for instance, not more than 25% students in a given batch opt for econometric course. And I think part of the blame should be taken by us, the teachers, and the authors of the books that we teach. So with this, let me start the discussion. This book, as Dr. Padma rightly pointed out, this book is divided into 8 chapters spread over 3 sections. And of course, it starts with a very nice preface which lays down the basic problems that the authors face, when they look at the currently taught popular econometrics textbooks. Following that, they just lay down the core in which they do 2 things. In chapter 1, they discuss the basic research questions that every researcher has to be clear about before one starts on the actual process of carrying out the research exercise. So the authors highlight here 4 research questions, and then in the next chapter they move to one very fundamental issue of detecting causality from the experimental data. Okay, so these are the first 2. I'll come back to it in a short while. The next part consists of 3 chapters which deal with 3 important techniques, I would say, of uncovering the causal effects among the variables of interest. First is a simple regression exercise that we carry out, simple regression models, of course with multiple variables, and then they move on to the case of instrumental variables, and third they look at the difference in difference models. This covers the core of this book, and then there are 3 chapters towards the end which discuss some advanced issues. The first chapter in this, that is chapter 6, is on research discontinuities in research design. B, they talk about quantile regression, and C, in the last chapter of the book, that is chapter 8, they talk about the issues about standard errors on which the inference heavily relies. So now of this, so coming to the first part, that is the research question, the chapters 1 and 2, which lay down the basic introduction to this book. The authors highlight that before the research exercise starts, one has to be clear about 4 clear questions. A, what is the causal relationship that they have in mind? Of course, the authors themselves admit that this is not true in all the exercises, but yes, in most of the econometric exercises, one is trying to discover some causal relation among the set of variables of interest. This causal relation is also of interest because once you have uncovered this causal relation, you can then talk about prediction using the explanatory variables, which can be useful in other types of analysis such as policy analysis. The second question is, in order to do this, to answer these causal relations, we need to conduct experiment to conduct the data. So we should be clear about the type of experiment that we need to conduct. That is the second research question. The third is, once we have covered the data, what is the identification strategy? We are talking about some causal relationships. What strategies do we adopt in order to identify those causal relationships? And fourth is the mode of statistical inference. Okay, and the subsequent chapter, they highlight one very important issue. They say that when we are through a very nice example of people who go to hospitals and who do not go to hospitals, they highlight the fact that when we are trying to infer the causal relations from the survey data, at times, or rather most of the times, the conclusions will be affected by sample selection bias. So for instance, in this case, they say that if we are trying to look at the effect of hospital sort of attendance on people, one important fact is that only those people will be going to hospitals which had some health problem in first instance. So we need to have some way of getting around this sample selection bias if we are to have reliable inference about the causal effects. And there they highlight the role of random assignments, random trials. So I think it is very beautifully sort of highlighted in that chapter. But this is the core. As I said, I am not a labor economist, and which has its advantages as well as disadvantages. So for instance, being a student of time series econometrics, I don't have the luxury of having 500 or 10,000 5,000 or 10,000 observations. In time series, even if we have 300 observations, we say, yeah, we are very rich. We have 300 observations, number one. Number two, we don't have the luxury of assuming random samples. Randomness is something that we can't even think about. So we always are grappling with the problems of autocorrelation, etc. Given this fact, I am in completely different, I think, league as far from Mr. English and Dr. English and Prishke, because they are labor economists. I am not at all a labor economist. So I think on the advanced research questions, I'm not the right person to comment. We have people here like Dr. Naveen Thomas and Dr. Apurva Gupta who work in such areas. So I think they are the right people to comment on this. I'm not the right person. I would instance focus on 2 chapters of this book, which I think should be of interest even to a beginner in the type of courses that we have in our second year and third year econometrics courses. My focus will be mostly on those, and Dr. Naveen Thomas, being a specialist in labor economics, will, I hope, take care of the rest. So I hope, Dr. Thomas, that is right. That is fine.
Well, I'll probably differ on that, but more when I start.
Okay.
So I'll let you continue then.
Yeah, thank you. So just give me a minute. In chapter 3, which is the first part of the core chapter, the authors start with the idea of linear regression function. Now, coming to the issue of mostly harmless, what I understood by looking at this book is that the term harmless is used, as I have discussed before, to highlight the fact that when we open any econometrics textbook, it starts with very complex looking notation and jargon, which I think, and I totally agree with the authors, that at times this unnecessary complication may be unnecessary to convey the concepts. So the authors really start in a way which is, I think, which is the foundation of econometrics, of regression analysis that we do, but is not highlighted well in most of the books. And then the sequence in which the authors take up these issues is something I think that I really appreciate. So for instance, the authors start with the question of linear regression. What is linear regression? Now, I think if we ask any student what is regression, they would say it is simply we regress y on x and we find the estimator for beta and we find the estimator for alpha using the normal equations and we study their distributions and then we do the prediction. I think that is the idea that most of the students get. But I think what we need to understand is the basic idea of a regression function. Regression function is nothing but your conditional expectation function. We have, if suppose I have 2 variables x and y, they have a joint distribution. Unless x and y are independent of each other, the distribution of y conditional on x will depend on x. And when I'm studying relation between 2 variables x and y, of course, this can be easily generalized to a set of multiple variables, but just to focus on the ideas, I'm looking at 2 variable regression. So in trying to unravel the relation between x and y, I'm just trying to see how the distribution of y conditional on x varies with the variation in the values of x. That is the basic idea of conditional expectation function, which is also called the regression function. And in running regression, I'm trying to estimate this function. So 2 things that I need to highlight here. A, the distribution of y conditional on x and its entire distribution. And when we have a whole distribution before us, what we try to do is, the first thing we try to do is to summarize it using some measure of center tendency. Mean or the expected value is the most commonly used measure of center tendency, the first measure of center tendency that we come across, and that is the reason we look at the expected value of the conditional distribution, how that varies with x. So that is how we start with regression analysis. So this is really beautifully highlighted. And then the authors discuss the implications of this for the deviation of values, individual values of y from this expectation function, and then the independence assumptions. So using the assumption of independence of the deviation of individual values of y from expected of the conditional expectation, the independence of this from x, using this, one easily finds, and I think the best place to look at this in undergrad level is the book by Jeffrey Woolridge. One finds there that, for instance, this two-variable regression, the slope coefficient simply turns out to be equal to the ratio of covariance between x and y and variance of x. This can be generalized to multiple regression by looking at, recourse to a very important result which was given by Frisch and Waugh in a very nice paper in 1933 and by Michael Lowell in 1962, and that's why it is called the Frisch-Lowell theorem, FWL theorem, which says that if I'm regressing a variable y on k explanatory variables, the coefficient of an individual variable, let me say kth variable, can be found by a bivariate regression in which the dependent variable is the residual that I obtain by regressing y on all the other regressors, and the independent variable is the regressor that I obtain by the residuals that I obtain by regressing my explanatory variables of interest on all other variables. Okay, so once I have found those deviations, I can simply express the coefficient as, I'm talking about the population coefficient as the ratio of covariance and the variance. Okay, so this is about the linear function. But even if we before do this, the authors highlight another important point here, that in real world, the regression functions may or may not be linear. The books, most of them talk about linear regression functions, which the authors try to justify at a later point in the same section. But of course, one may or may not agree with that. I have a reason at least to disagree with that. But then one thing they highlight, which is sort of, I think we must appreciate. Unfortunately, again, it is not discussed in many textbooks. I think the only good book which I have come across which discusses regression function in general terms is the book by Davidson and McKinnon, Inference and Estimation in Econometrics, 1993. So the point is, when we say regression function doesn't have to be linear in parameters. It could take any form. So when we see we are in regression, the point is we are trying to find the expected, the conditional expectation function. It could be linear, it could be non-linear. This conditional expectation function has one important property, that if this gives us if we were to find the predicted values of y, this gives us the predictions with the minimum mean squared error. Squared error from y. Mean squared error gives me an average measure of this squared error. So this gives me idea of how good my fit is, how good a predictor I'm using. And to put it to put a minimum gives me the best possible predictor that I can get in some sense. This average or the conditional expectation function serves that purpose also. Okay, and that is why regression analysis is important. Then the authors look at why we look at linear regression function in general. There are two justifications given. One I think is familiar to all of you, that if the joint distribution is multivariate normal, then the conditional expectation function will be a linear function. So if the joint distribution is normal, then of course this is justified. But the authors then take recourse to the linear approximation, and they highlight that even if the actual distribution is not joint normal, which is of course the case as is being increasingly discovered. But even in that case, the first approximation, reasonable one, would be linear approximation. So if we were to find a best linear predictor, it would be still your linear regression function. Okay, at which point I think even though the authors also highlight that it can just be a rough guide about the relation between two variables, and as is clear from the expansion in research on nonlinear models during past 2 decades at least, it is clear that we are increasingly discovering now that the regression functions are in general not linear. So as a first approximation, in a very narrow range of variation of explanatory variables, it is fine. But to me, beyond that, it is not that good an approximation. So then we come to the issue of inference. The authors discuss some important properties. I would quickly, because we are really short of time, I would jump to the next issue, that of inference. Once we have recognized what is it that we are trying to estimate, the question is how do we estimate that? Because the regression function, as we have discussed so far, it is still a population regression function, which we don't have luxury of having. So what we need to do is we need to estimate it using the sample data. The sample data might be collected by conducting experiments, controlled experiments, which is very common, for instance, in many cases, it is possible in areas such as labor economics, but impossible in many other areas such as macroeconomics. So we cannot sort of turn the wheel back and generate another series of GDP for India. So, there are data could be generated in different manner. The problem of inference is about estimating these parameters from these data. And again, here when in the books, when we find a set of assumptions which constitute the classical linear regression model and then some formula, etc. The authors again start very nicely by highlighting the fact that we can easily find reasonably good estimators under reasonably general assumptions if we can, based on 5 important results in econometrics. Those results are A, the law of large numbers, which say that as sample size increases, the sample mean of a random variable from a sample of a mean from a random sample. So this sample mean approaches in probability to the population mean. Second is the central limit theorem, which talks about the distribution, asymptotic distribution of this sample mean. The third important result is the Slutsky theorem, which talks about asymptotic, the distribution of sum and product of random variables, which with known asymptotic distribution means the distributions. It could be degenerate, in which case they have a probability limit, or non-degenerate, in which case you have their distribution. But the point is, if we have two sequences A and B and N denoting the sample size, as the sample size increases indefinitely, what happens to the distributions of AN plus BN and AN times BN as the sample size increases? Then continuous mapping theorem, which is in a way tells us that if the function h is continuous at the point of evaluation, then consistency passes over. And finally, the delta method, which helps us derive the variances. So authors say that once we have these 5 results, we can easily study the asymptotic, we can derive the estimators, and we can study their asymptotic properties. Asymptotic properties, it is important for us to highlight here. And it is in a way, I would say, contradiction to what they write in the first part of the book. At one point, they say that we are not bothered that much about the asymptotic issues. Of course, they highlight asymptotic efficiency there, which is fine. But it's good that they start with the discussion of asymptotic efficiency, because in many cases, the results are not known for finite samples. So they start with issue of asymptotic results, and using that, for instance, they are derived the estimators. So, for instance, we have seen that the OLS estimator is simply the ratio of variance and covariance. Once we have the sample counterparts, they can be expressed in terms of sample averages of certain random functions of these underlying sample values. So these estimators, the sample corresponding sample moments, if we replace, if these corresponding sample moments which are consistent estimators of the population moments, if they replace these population variance and population covariance, we get a very good consistent estimator for population parameter. And then, this law of large numbers helps us derive this OLS estimator in very nice intuitive manner instead of going to all these derivations in first place. Similarly, we can discuss the distribution by recourse to the central limit theorem here asymptotically. Okay, and one very good thing that the authors do here is that they do not take the assumption of homoscedasticity for given. Of course, I can understand, given the data from labor economics, it would be slightly difficult for them to do this, but I think it can be easily generalized to the case when we are dealing with time series data. So even autocorrelation doesn't have to be assumed, and one can derive in a similar vein the estimators of the type that were given by Newey and West in their seminal 1987 paper, and of course modified later by others such as Andrews in 1990s. Anyway, but I think to begin with, to derive an estimator which is robust with respect to heteroscedasticity is, I think, itself is a welcome thing. I think this is what I'll say about regression, this part, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll very quickly comment on one another thing that is from chapter 7 of this book. And the basic idea is the following. We have said the regression is about that. In regression analysis, we are talking about how the conditional distribution of y varies with the variation in x, and we say we look at in basic regression we look at the mean of this conditional distribution. But the question is, why is only mean? The entire distribution may be of interest to us, and if the distribution itself varies in shape or in spread or both over time, one should then look at not just the conditional mean, but the conditional fractiles, like the conditional deciles and conditional percentiles and conditional quintiles. And that is what we do in quantile regression. So if for instance, if we are studying how the conditional deciles vary over with the changes in value of x, and they do not change in an identical manner, that means the distribution changes with as the values of x change, which itself is a very good sort of, very important factor. So in data studies based on cross-section data in particular. So I think we should also, at least at introductory level, I think we should also highlight the role of change in distributions, which can be highlighted through the role of through the quantile regression, and more so because it is now easily available in popular platforms like R. So I hope I have not exceeded my time limit. So Dr. Padma, thank you so much. Over to you.
Dr. Naveen Thomas, you can take it.
Yeah, so I'll probably put up my presentation, and let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, sure.
Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you, Professor Kumawat, for outlining the book quite in detail. So that makes my job a little bit more difficult, because speaking second means that some of the things that you planned to discuss has already been discussed by the first speaker. So I'll try and work my way around the topics which have already been discussed in detail. Now, as Professor Padma was telling us, that this book received the Eugene Farmer Prize for being an exceptional PhD level textbook in economics and finance in 2018. And that helps us put in perspective of where to place this book and what this word mostly harmless means. Now, obviously, from the perspective of econometrics, what the authors are suggesting is that you can use your everyday tools, the standard toolkit of an econometrician, even at the very basic level, which is your regression analysis and IV estimators, your DIDs, to elicit some causal inference, right? So on the other hand, the mostly harmless the sequence of words comes from a series of science fiction books called the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and Mostly Harmless is the fifth and last edition to this. Okay, so this is how we actually place this book. This is a book not for beginners, but for fairly advanced readers. Now, there's a little bit for everyone here, so I don't want to dissuade undergraduate students from reading it. There is something for undergraduate students here as well, as I'll mention in the course of the of my discussion. So, what definitely this book is, it is a fantastic companion for people doing advanced research or are in a PhD program, and one should definitely go through that once you've obviously gone through the standard textbooks. So the next thing is, what sort of companion is this? Now, a companion can be of different types. There can be a companion who's not very approachable, but knows everything about everything that is there to know about econometrics. There might be another companion who is more jovial, easy to talk to, as well as is fairly well read about everything. And then there is a companion who is fairly motivational, but at the same time knows his concepts. So I would place this book mostly as a third type of companion. The second type would be something of the sort of micro econometrics by Cameron and Trivedi. The first type would be probably for me econometric analysis by Green. So this is a great textbook to motivate you towards causal analysis, and this is something that at least with the introductory chapters can be introduced for the applied econometrics course in the undergraduate level. Now, yes, I am a labor economist, but the only challenge here is that I'm a theoretical labor economist. So most of these techniques I don't use in my own research, but definitely they are starting points to start to think about applying my theory to econometrics and putting it to data. Now, what I really like about this book, besides everything else, it's a fantastic book to read, is also the way they end the book. Now, let me read this excerpt from this. So it reads, if applied econometrics was easy, theorists would do that, right? So that the pun is intended on me. But it's not as hard as the dense pages of Econometrica Galactica, as they call it. I'd probably guess that it's they're talking about econometric analysis by Green. Carefully applied to causal questions, regression and to SLS almost always make sense. Your standard errors probably won't be quite right, but they rarely are. Avoid embarrassment by being your own skeptic. Especially don't panic. What I really like about this book is that between the math, the book is extremely jovial and makes you think about everything in a lot more detail. Unlike a more rigorous book, which will probably between the lines make you want to go to sleep. Right, so that's something that's really great about it, and they try to highlight the importance of regression analysis and 2SLS in causal studies and causal analysis. Now, why this is important is that the standard descriptive analysis that we typically do in undergraduate level is not something that that sells well when you're trying to publish papers. Anything that's descriptive is very, very hard to publish. So getting students to think in a causal framework is always very, very helpful. And the earlier you do that, the better. It might be at a very introductory level, but it's still worth including. What is also nice about this book is that they constantly refer to studies and causal questions as they take you through certain important topics through the book. Now, these causal questions include, do class sizes increase learning? Do minimal wages reduce employment? Should wife beaters be arrested, and so on? So this is not an exhaustive list of the causal questions, but these are, but these really help with the sort of pedagogy that they're following. Now, what this book is and what it's not. Now, this book definitely is very helpful, extremely helpful, as a refresher, as a book that you could read from the first page to the last page for a fairly advanced reader. But it's not the first book that you should be reading. So that's why it's often used as a companion text along with something like probably Green at an advanced level. And it also gives some really great introductions to certain topics like regression, discontinuity design, as well as quantile regressions. So this is best left as a more advanced read. But what is also nice is the sort of jovial pedagogy that they follow. So let me very quickly outline the book. Some of this has already been done by Professor Kumawat, but let me take you through certain things probably that were missed by him. Now, the something for everyone in this book is chapter 1 and 2, and I definitely feel that this should be read by everyone. At least these two chapters should be read by everyone. The first chapter actually deals with how to organize your research plan, and and he talks about the frequently asked questions, which Professor Kumawat also discussed about, which is extremely important for any early researcher or anyone thinking about studies in econometrics to go through. I won't go into the details of that because that has already been discussed. The second chapter is also extremely interesting because it explains the selection problem. Now, why is this so important? Even if you were doing a descriptive analysis, probably you will be analyzing, as a labor economist, you most likely will be analyzing the effect of certain policy on your variable of interest. Now, you might not be thinking of it as a causal relation. Probably you're just thinking of it as correlations, as any regression study would do. But what this section tells you is that you can actually push your study towards causality. You may not be able to establish causality, but you will be at least be able to say something more about it. Now, the identification of the selection problem helps you ask if you can really kill the selection problem with by conditioning your regression on a certain set of variables, and hence can establish causality even with your secondary data and your standard regression analysis. Now, always placing your question in this frame, your research question and your relation that you want to estimate in this framework is extremely, extremely helpful in my perspective. And honestly speaking, in the more recent research that I'm doing on the impact of public schools on education outcomes of children in rural India, the data doesn't allow us to push it to a pure causal analysis, but using this framework, we can at least identify the direction of selection bias, which helps us to argue that whatever estimates that we have are definitely not an overestimate, but definitely are an underestimate. Right? So the selection bias is negative. So the actual causal effect will be much stronger than it seems, and that's something that's quite useful to speak, even if it's a mostly descriptive paper. Now, for more advanced readers, chapter 3, 4, and 5 are really good ways to sort of get a different perspective on the things that they've already done in probably their master's and PhD coursework. What I really like about chapter 3 is that they take a different approach, as Professor Kumawat was telling us. that they look at OLS as a best linear predictor rather than talking about it as a best linear unbiased estimator or a blue estimator as we typically teach it at the undergraduate and probably even at the postgraduate levels. I'm not saying that Green does not discuss it. And Green is typically the book that you often use at the postgraduate level. There is a discussion of best linear predictor in chapter 4, but it definitely not as the focus there, right? So this is a slightly different pedagogy that they follow on trying to generalize OLS as a best linear predictor, which is less restrictive than thinking of it as the best linear unbiased estimator, where the linear nature of the conditional expectation function takes a center stage. Now, a couple of other very interesting discussions are on bad controls and the comparison between regression and matching methods, and limited dependent variables and marginal effects. What I really find interesting in this discussion, especially in the last one on limited dependent variable and marginal effects, is that they actually go all the way to support OLS for your limited dependent variable models, and say that often they might be even better than your Probit and Tobit models. Even though when you're using these limited dependent variable models, you might get the odd problem of the predicted probability being less than 0. But despite that, in saturated models, if you can get them, the limited dependent variables are very, very useful as a tool for analysis, which is often something that as researchers we completely avoid. We try for limited dependent variables, we try to stick strictly to logit probit models. So this is something that they've done really nicely, and I found that quite interesting. Now, coming to chapter 4, they take you in detail through through instrument variables in analysis. And what I really like about it, and I find it as a true addition to all the existing textbooks, is they talk about standard mistakes that one can make in 2SLS estimation. Right? So there are 3 standard problems that they discuss about. And my objective is not to take you into the details of that. Probably I want to tease the book enough so that you go ahead and read it. So that's something really nice about that chapter. And of very special interest to me in this discussion is the problems that one faces when one is trying to estimate peer effects. Now, more often now than earlier in applied econometrics, we're trying to deal with, we're trying to introduce a role of one's surroundings and one's society on certain personal outcome variables. Now, the problem with that is, for a theoretician like me, that's something that's fairly easy to deal with, right? And that's fairly critical as well. In fact, a lot of my research centers around peer effects and the role of society on various variables of interest like labor force participation and so on. But when it comes to empirics, these peer effects are extremely difficult to estimate. Now, there's a very nice discussion on that, and I highly recommend even people who have read pretty much everything in econometrics to definitely go through that section, right? And coming to chapter 5, it talks about fixed effects, a difference in difference estimators, and the panel data. What is nice is the difference in difference estimator treatment. It's not as easy to read as probably a textbook like Woolridge, but it's definitely can be used as an introductory, sort of an introductory chapter, if you essentially want to discuss difference in difference estimators. And they also go in quite a bit of detail in trying to understand the problem in two-period difference in difference estimators when the underlying trends are different. So they talk about how to be able to estimate trends as well as the treatment effect simultaneously. The discussion on that is fairly helpful. Going forward, there's some great introductions to regression discontinuity design, but I also at the same time highly recommend reading the seminal paper by Han et al. For regression discontinuity design. And as Professor Kumawat was telling us, quantile regressions are also a very interesting topic, and chapter 7 can be used as at least an introduction to quantile regressions. What I also particularly find interesting is chapter 8, which reads non-standard standard error issues. So one of the primary challenges in econometric inference is heteroscedasticity, and we often tend to use robust standard errors all the same in our regression analysis because data makes it so easy to do that. So the author talks about the bias introduced by robust standard errors, not in your parameter estimates, but in the variance covariance matrix estimates. And they say that when heteroscedasticity is either not there or very small, often these biases are fairly large. And to put things into perspective, he says that the problem of heteroscedasticity in general is not as problematic as something like clustering and serial correlation in panels, because even in the worst case scenario, even after correcting for heteroscedasticity, your standard errors won't change by more than 25%. So it's less serious of a problem than, let's say, clustering. Right, so whenever your data does have clustering, it is a much more serious issue, and your standard errors can differ by factors of 3 or 4. Right, but correcting for clustering is very easy with Stata, but there are problems with that because most of the effectiveness of correcting for clustering really depends upon you having a fairly large number of clusters, which is often not the case in with the data that you might often have. So suppose I'm trying to adjust for clustering by states, by Indian states, you obviously will not have a very large number of clusters, right? So that's something that's worth reading. It obviously can be introduced to undergraduate students, but it has to probably be filtered a little bit by the instructor. So what it also says is that serial correlation was something, or correlation over time for variables was something that only concerned time series econometricians. But given the serious problems introduced by in inference by clustering, this is something that worries applied econometricians too, and more so because clustering is not something that can be corrected that easily, right? So corrected easily is not in the Stata sense. That's very easy to do, but it's not very easy to deal with, especially when you have a fewer number of clusters, as I was talking about earlier. So what's next? So this definitely was, as I told you, a fairly advanced companion. But what's interesting is the sort of pedagogy and the very interesting in between the math sort of reading that Angrist and Pishke have introduced. And that definitely is worth exploring in their master's level or graduate level textbook on mastering metrics, the path from cause to effect. And I think this is something that can be explored for the applied econometrics course that is taught at the undergraduate level, at least portions of that, because introducing that way of looking at econometrics is very, very critical, because a purely descriptive style of doing regression is no longer what is useful for at least the publication perspective, and it's always more interesting to to have causal relations than just saying that one thing is correlated to the other, and I can't say much more than that. And I'll end with this, and in the spirit of Angus and Pishkin, I'll end by a quote by Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Arthur blinked at the screen and felt he was missing something important, and suddenly he realizes what it was. Is there any tea in the spaceship, he asks. And with that, I end. And I obviously miss the tea and interaction if this was a more in-person meeting. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kumawat and Dr. Thomas. Thank you very much for taking us and guiding us through the contents of this book. I think both the panelists are saying, at least since many of those attending the session today are our students from economics honors, perhaps what both panelists are suggesting is that it would be worthwhile at least beginning with the initial chapters maybe. And for students who are interested in pursuing master's and doctoral level programs, this would be, it would be a good idea maybe to have the book, and along with perhaps mastering metrics. And if at this level, maybe if they're not able to follow the mathematics, as Dr. Thomas has been saying, that maybe looking at the different examples that are there in the book, that may be very useful in the sense that going through these examples, not only to students, but other researchers also, it would give some idea, you know, about how to be curious about day-to-day problems and programs that we see. Because when we read textbooks of econometrics, most of these apply to problems or issues that are there for the US or other countries. So for India, I think, which many students should be able to relate to. Questions like, do smaller classes increase learning? How much does education raise earnings? These type of questions, asking questions and then finding causal links. Maybe students would be encouraged to do it in the Indian context, and this would also be for researchers. I think we need more of this kind of applied econometrics research which we can relate to. And I think young researchers may also get some kind of an instructional idea from the examples in the book as to how to explore data sets, how to uncover structures in the data sets which can lead to something like policy impact evaluation or establishing causal links, basically. So thank you very much, Dr. Kumawat and Dr. Thomas. It's been great to have you with us and for contributing to this book discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that extremely insightful session. So with the book discussion coming to an end, now move to the first panel of the research presentation, which will be chaired by Dr. Krishna Kumar. I would like to invite Abhivyakti Gupta, the Joint Secretary of our Economic Society, to introduce the panelists. Abhivyakti, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. So today's research panel, for the first research panel, we're discussing 3 papers. The first speaker is Mr. Pranav Sidhwani. He's one of our alumni, and he's currently a director at the Commercial Advisory and Strategy Infrastructure in Ontario, Toronto. He did his master's from Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research and MPA from John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. Today, he's here to discuss with us the paper on spatial inequalities in big Indian cities. The second paper of discussion is titled Nakusha, Son Preference, Resource Concentration and Gender Gaps in Education. it will be presented by Dr. Apurva Gupta. She is currently faculty at Ramjas College, University of Delhi. She obtained her master's and doctorate from Department of Economics at Delhi School of Economics, and she was also a recipient of the Krishna Raj Fellowship offered by Delhi School of Economics in 2010. The third speaker will be Harshal Kaur. He is an economist with a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Sorry, she is an economist with a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and her research interests include disciplines of law and economics. Her research work mainly focuses on the efficiency of liability rules under ambit of tort laws, and currently she is working as an assistant professor at College of Vocational Studies. The paper we will be discussing today is the economic approach to law, understanding tort liability. Over to Mr. Krishna Kumar.
Yeah, let's start the session straight. And first we have Pranav Sidhwani. Pranav? Has Pranav not joined it?
Oh,
Yes,
hi,
Pranav.
good morning.
Can you just come on video also so that our teachers can see you
Yes,
also?
yes,
Pranav
yes.
is also alumnus and,
Yes.
and he's joining from Toronto. He has already, Abhivakti has given the introduction. So over to Pranav. Let us start with your paper itself. And after the paper, I would request Yogita to discuss, because Pranav is coming from another time zone. Possibly we will complete your paper and discussion and then go to the next paper. Okay.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, KK sir, and good morning, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar names and a lot of unfamiliar names, and I did turn my camera on mainly to shock my former professors, because when I was in college, my hair used to be the complete opposite of this, and this is just a COVID disaster that happened to me 2 weeks ago. Anyway, let me try to project my slide here.
So you will have some 15 minutes to present, you can.
Yep, let me just pull it up.
There's a present now on this end. So
yep.
You can...
All right, can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Also, just testing it out. Is it going to the?
Moving.
Okay, it's moving. Okay, all right. I'm not used to using Google Slides, so I was just checking. So, thank you. And as you said, KK sir, Abhivyakta already introduced me, so I wouldn't get into a lot of details. But I did graduate from Venki in 2009. And again, thank you, KK sir, for reaching out and for the opportunity to present a paper that I wrote a few years ago now. I published this paper in the EPW back in 2015 when I was working at the Center for Policy Research, which is a research think tank based in Delhi, very close to Venki, actually. And a caveat there, as you may have guessed from the introduction, I am no longer a researcher, so take this with a grain of salt. And I did manage to capture the very end of the previous presentation. So I would say here is that in this paper, there's not econometric rigor, but what I did attempt to do with this paper was to understand the data that is available to us and uncover patterns, as Dr. Padma Suresh mentioned, that's a critical piece that we don't really get to see a lot of, especially in the Indian context. So at a very high level, what I tried to do in this paper was to use ward level data that was released by the census to understand the pattern of residential segregation in the 10 most populated Indian cities by caste. And what I mean by that is trying to understand the extent to which some wards within these big cities, so each urban agglomeration or city in India is divided into wards by the census. So just trying to understand the extent to which some wards within these big cities, whether they see an over representation of the SC/ST population compared to aggregates. Moreover, in the paper, what I also tried to understand was how this segregation compares with and is interrelated with access of households to in-house tap water, which I call a basic public good, in-house toilets, which what I call basic private goods, and ownership of a two-wheeler, which I call a luxury good, and which I believe remains a luxury good for a lot of people in India. So moving on, the first thing on this slide, just a high-level agenda, and what I'll start with is give you a little more of the context and the motivation behind working on this paper, followed by a quick description of the data and some of the issues that I found working with the data. I will then get into some of the methodology as to how I went about looking at whether there is overrepresentation, how that compares to access to certain goods. I will then highlight some key findings, and the keyword here is some, and I will qualify that when I talk about the methodology. And then I will leave you with some parting thoughts, and maybe hope we can get some time at the end to talk about, to have answer questions that you might have. So moving on to the context and the motivation here, urban sociologists for a very long time have argued that cities lead to a breakdown of existing social structures and giving birth to new structures. What does this mean in the Indian context? I mean, Dr. Ambedkar, who was a big fan of city life, urged marginalized people to move to cities and leave behind the den of iniquity, which is what he called the Indian village. And given the pace of growth India has seen starting the early to mid 90s, and listening to these urban sociologists, one may think it is a safe assumption to make that caste has now given way to a class consciousness or a class identity in Indian cities. But at the same time, it has also been said that segregation of our spaces, especially in the cities, is a key feature. And going back to the previous point, segregation by class is definitely expected. We have rich neighborhoods and we have poor neighborhoods in our cities. But back when I was writing this paper, what wasn't really explored was segregation, spatial segregation by caste, and how that relates to, if at all, with class dynamics. And the main motivation for, the main inspiration I drew for this paper was another paper by Venkateswara and Singh back in 2012, where they studied spatial segregation based on data from the 2001 census, which really looked at how residential segregation by caste compared to segregation by socioeconomic status, and they use male literacy as a proxy for socioeconomic status, and try to see how cities compare on both the different measures. And what they found was, in cities, residential segregation by caste is more prominent than residential segregation by socioeconomic status, right? So this essentially shows the interplay between caste and class, and how caste seems to be still a more prominent feature of our cities than class. So moving into the data piece, the timing for when I started thinking about this paper was also perfect, if I can say that. For the first time ever, so the census data traditionally has granular data to the level of wards, and as I said, wards, each city is divided into wards, only for certain metrics like the population of SC/ST, the total population, male, female, literate versus illiterate. But for the first time ever, back in 2014, I believe, the census released data at a granular level for a variety of different metrics. So This included access to stuff like water, access to toilets, access to luxury goods, ownership of assets, internet, TV. So it was the first time ever that this particular data set was released. So the first set of data that I mentioned is contained in what is called the primary census abstract. And the more the data on access to goods is contained in this data set that I call HH amenities. Now, what this essentially required was merging of these two data sets, and there were several issues that I identified uh, in trying to merge those two tables, and I just want to highlight a couple of them for you because I think Padma ma'am raised a very important point, which is how do people work with data? But I think what folks really need to understand is the limitations with the data that we have, because your analysis, be it econometric or any sort of analysis that you do, a quantitative analysis that you do, is only as good as the data that you have. So it's really important to understand the limitations of your data. So when I say there were issues with the data, some were expected. And I say that because the census is conducted in two phases. So the PCA data was conducted in a phase that was different from when HF amenities was conducted. So there's bound to be fluctuations in the number of households and populations over a period of time. So that was expected. But there were also unexpected issues, like the number of wards were different between the two data sets, which should not happen. The actual number, the code of the ward was different, right? So I tried to adjust for those so that I was comparing apples to apples as much as I could. So the example I like to use is, I think apples to oranges is a problem, but as long as you can compare jazz apples to Granny Smith, I think that's good enough to strive for. And lastly, once I did manage to merge the two data sets, the key variables that I used was, at the ward level, what's the proportion of SC/ST households? What's the proportion of households with access to in-house tap water, which, as I said, I call a basic public good? Or what's the proportion of households with access to in-house toilets, which is the basic private good? And what's the proportion of households that have a two-wheeler, which I call a luxury good? So in terms of the methodology that I used, I really wanted to attack this from different angles, and that's essentially because there's no one best way to study residential segregation in the Indian context. So there's a lot of research that has been done on residential segregation by race in the Western world, but there's very little that has been done in the Indian context. So there are issues in using the metrics that are traditionally used in the Western world, because our structures and how we define wards in our cities is very different. For example, what is used in the US is called a census tract, which is a properly defined unit within a metropolitan area that has a fixed number of people, and there is no variation across the city in the sizes of these census tracts. Whereas if you look at our census data back in India, the ward size ranges from thousands to lakhs within the same city. So there is this lack of research in the Indian context, which makes it hard to use just one single thing to really look at this problem. So the approaches that I try to use, the first one is comparing outlier wards with the total wards. And what I mean by that is I tried to see if there were certain wards within each of the 10 cities that had a significant overrepresentation of households, of SC/ST households. And how I define the outlier, I'll try not to be very technical here, but maybe for this one point I will. Outliers are calculated as observations which have values greater than the third quartile plus 1.5 times the interquartile range. And I only look at the top end, so I'm just going to define that for you. But if you've ever seen a box plot, it has a third quartile, first quartile, median, and then there's lines on the top and bottom, and you would see dots on top of those lines. So those dots are the outliers. And what I did was I tried to compare these outlier wards to the average, to what the numbers were for the city as aggregate numbers. So this really, the first approach tries to compare how wards or parts of cities where there tends to be higher proportion of SC/ST population fare against the average in terms of access to the three goods. The second approach is using the index of segregation, and this is really building on the paper that motivated this research, trying to compare segregation by different variables across cities. So and then compare different cities with each other, and really try to see if a city is more or less segregated based on caste versus access to water, and how the different cities rank against each other on these two, on the four metrics. And the last approach was trying to understand the association between the variables. So looking at the correlations and statistical significance of those correlations, really trying to understand, do they tend to move in the same direction? So is having a higher proportion of SC/ST households positively or negatively correlated with having access to the basic private, the basic public, or the luxury good. So given that we're short on time, I'm just going to present some results on the first metric, which really shows how these outlier wards compare to the city. And this essentially is the table that I wanted to show to everyone. It's nicely formatted. That's not me. There was an article in the Mint where this was published, and they nicely designed the table, so I just lifted it from there. But at a very high level, in the 10 cities that I analyzed, the outlier wards had at least twice the proportion of SC/ST households compared to the city average. And if you look at the numbers, and I'm not going to go line by line, in all cities barring Delhi, these extreme wards do worse in terms of household access to in-house water and in-house latrines, in-house toilets, which really are the basic goods that you expect folks to, or hope folks have access to. So, and I do want to call out what I saw for Kolkata specifically here, that out of a total of 141 wards in the city, there's only a total of 5.6% of the population that's SC/ST, but there's really only 12 out of 141 wards where over 40% of the city's SC/ST population resides. So it really shows how stark the inequality might be in Kolkata. So all of this to say, really trying to see how access is, how there is a difference in access to goods based on concentration of a specific group of people, and this tends to show that may actually be true. And so we're already at 17 minutes, I think. So just some quick parting thoughts here. So as I said, along with this, I also did study the index of segregation, and I also tried to study associations, and most evidence that I found was for I mean, showed that there was residential segregation based on caste, and there was inequality in terms of access to certain goods. And a lot of the narratives that we hear that caste identities are blurring is mainly anecdotal, and further quantitative research is required to either prove that wrong or right. And this paper can only go so far given the limitations of underlying data and the lack of spatial research back when I was doing this project. It is heartening to see that a lot more people have gained an interest in doing spatial analyses, and I see that a lot of people are taking this forward. I recently saw a paper that was published that built on some of the work that I've done previously. I have also had the pleasure of having my paper completely plagiarized and published in the EPW. So don't do that. But it does show that people have started to think about this. And what I would end with is where I began, and that really is the motivation piece here. One of the key reasons for me working on this was to hopefully and not inspire but encourage researchers to try and look at this sociological problem from a quantitative lens and really try to understand and dig deeper into how our cities can be made more inclusive. So with that, I will stop. Thank you, and let's open it up for questions.
Thank you, Pranav. Thank you, Pranav, for this presentation, which draws attention specifically to exclusion or inegalitarian access to public goods in urban social spaces also. Though, of course, the general contention was that the social grouping and its hierarchies is something which is very specific to the rural countryside. May I now request Yogita Yadav to make observations on this particular paper before we throw the floor open for discussion.
Yeah. So hi Pranav and good morning everyone. So that was a really there were some insights from your paper, because I feel that public intellectuals, they continue to advocate urbanization as some sort of panacea for the caste-based inequality that is there in India's traditional. Just a second. Yeah, because urbanization has always been cited as some sort of a panacea for the caste-based inequality that we see. And this summer, I did a research project with some of my students, where we also we used the NSSO's consumption expenditure survey data to look at the inequality measures, and one of the dimension that we also looked at was caste. So there was an observation that we made during the research project, and that invariably the inequality that was there in the urban areas was less than the ones observed in rural areas. So so as I was saying, urbanization has been casted as some sort of panacea, and the results that we got from our research paper also gave us the impression that urbanization will lead to making some dent in the caste structure that we have in our country. But your paper throws some light on this dimension, and we see that when it comes to SC households, there is spatial segregation within cities. Also, the paper also talks about spatial segregation when it comes to access to some basic public good, basic private good, and all. So yeah, there was some really insightful, some great insights. Just one thing I had a question in mind was that when we are using ward data from the ward level data from census, because wards have some the number of household in ward ranges from some 20,000, 30,000 to lakhs. So when we are using ward level data, can we say that we are underestimating the level of segregation that has happened in urban areas, or is there a way that we can we say that if we go finer into micro level, if micro level data was available, we would see more level of segregation in urban areas,
So,
caste-based segregation?
yeah, yep, for sure, 100%, and I think that's a very important point that you raised, because if you look at Mumbai, for example, there's wards with lakhs and lakhs of people in them. So as you expand the area, you're losing out on. I mean, we then need to look at sub wards if they exist. So, and I think there is a sub ward number in the census data, but it doesn't really make any sense. I think when I was writing this paper back in 2014, 2015, I did consider using NSS data as well. And the issue really is that as you try to go deeper and deeper into sample data, you lose observations, and then you lose the essence of the data, and it doesn't make sense to do with the survey data. So yes, totally agreed. I think that's one very important limitation that you've pointed. Another one is, I mean, the census still doesn't capture data on OBCs, for example. So that's one huge proportion of the population that we're missing. Another interesting piece is looking at religion and how that really plays in terms of segregation. That data has also not been captured in the census, or at least not reported in the census at the ward level. So there's still scope for further study, but as you noted, it's also contingent on organizations releasing more data. So thank you for those observations.
Yeah, so I think in 2015, when the data was released, they have gone deeper, and at least the SC/ST data, the caste-based data, is available at the enumerative blocks level also. So maybe that is something that the students from our batch, from the current batch, can do. That is something that the students can do. So yeah, thank you so much.
Any other questions from the audience? Anybody would have a question? Somebody is raising hands. Amit Jha, Ankit Joshi. Ankit Joshi, yes, Ankit.
Yeah. So I have so could you just let me know that did you look at given the same economic, if given the same income, is there still a segregation that people with lower caste, they have different access to public water as compared to people living in the same areas, or at same income level? Is that possible, or that segregation?
So I think that is challenging to do, because for that you really need data at the household level, which is not something that the census provides. The census also does not report any data on household incomes. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there is no source of data for income in India. It's only expenditure that's available, and then you can extrapolate you can make assumptions and use that as a proxy for income. But the NSS, as I said, is sample data, so you can't do that granular analysis because you wouldn't have enough observations.
Yes.
But good point, and I think that's where maybe the previous conversation becomes important, right? I think Dr. Thomas was talking about causality and econometric analysis, and that's where that really comes into play. That you start to control for factors like income to see if there is a lack of access, and I think there is an association between class and caste, so you may see similarities in household incomes if you look at certain parts of the city, but definitely interesting to compare segregation on other factors controlling for items like income.
So over to the next presentation. Yogita, you were about to make some other observation?
No, sir.
Yeah. So I think we will go to the next presentation, that is by Dr. Apurva Gupta, and she's
Sir,
looking.
one quick question if possible.
Yes, Jitesh.
Yeah. So hi Pranav, Jitesh this side. I wanted to ask, did you consider a comparison between rural, entities which would be parallel to wards and cities, and do a rural-urban sort of a comparison?
So so villages are not divided into wards, so you can actually, based on the data, you can't look at different parts of villages. There is only a single row of data for each village, so that is definitely challenging to do. So I did not look at that.
Yes. So thank you so much. And now we go over to the next presentation about another important issue. The first is of a social exclusion issue on public goods, which is already done. Now we are having this presentation by Dr. Apurva Gupta on DC or Sun preference, Nakusha. So over to Apurva, and I think we will follow this pattern itself, where after this, Ms. Meenakshi Sharma could possibly give the comments, and then we shall follow up with the discussion. But it would always be good for students also to ask certain questions after the presentations, because that would also be very encouraging for the speakers too. And okay, over to Apurva.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me for this research colloquium. I'm sharing my screen, so please do let me know if it is visible to all of you.
Yes, it is visible. Yeah, yes, it is visible.
Okay, so just a quick request, if students have any clarificatory questions, I request that they just unmute themselves and ask rather than writing them in the chat box or raising their hands, because it will be difficult for me to just switch the screens across. So if there is any clarificatory questions, just unmute yourself and ask. So this is a joint work with Professor Ashwini Deshpande, who is right now at Ashoka University. And I teach at Ramjas College. I'm a faculty at Ramjas College. So in this paper, we actually understand the reasons why there are gender gaps in education, and which motivates us to name this paper as Nakusha. So really, to understand what Nakusha means, so in rural Maharashtra, in Marathi language, several parents name their daughters as Nakusha, and Nakusha literally means unwanted. So it's like parents have certain daughters or certain number of daughters whom they never wanted to have. They are just being born, and hence they call them as Nakusha. Question is why they call them as Nakusha, or why those girls are being considered as unwanted girls. And the big answer to this simple question is son preference. We all know that, and there is a huge literature which actually documents that it's because of the son preference that families have, that there are huge gaps in educational outcomes, in health outcomes, in various accessibilities to public resources. And all these differences, they are all being clubbed to one umbrella term, which is the gender gap. And this, son preference, whatever the gender gaps are, those are being because of this son preference. And this son preference is not just a phenomena of developing countries, it's also a phenomena of developed countries as well. However, it's more visible, more vibrant in the developing countries, both due to the demand side factors and the supply side factors. Supply side factors could be like availability of schools in the nearby areas. And again, there is a literature which documents that most of the girls leave schools after primary education because there is no secondary schools in the nearby area, or the route to the school is not safe, or there are public or the toilets are not available in the schools. outcomes. So there are all these supply side factors, but there are also the demand side factors, which may not allow the girls to go to the schools, or do not allow the girls to have access to healthcare facilities and educational facilities. And all these demand side factors, or the household based factors, those are clubbed together under one big umbrella term, which is the son preference. And to study the son preference, or the gender gaps which are coming because of this son preference, it's most common, and it's usually the developing countries, especially the countries like India, China, and South Korea. These countries make a very important case studies and very big case studies to study all these things, mainly because of the fact that since old times, there is always this strong son preference, or the sons are always being preferred over to girls. And because of this strong son preference, families actually go for certain practices which make families to have, or to distort their size and the sex composition of the children. So practices like sex selective abortions, or prenatal sex determinations, or you can say sex selective feticide or infanticide, and all these are done, or all these are being considered to come under one big term, which is son preference. In our paper, what we are doing is we are saying that no, it may not be just a son preference. There could be many other competing explanations that why we see all these gaps across girls and boys, either in educational outcomes or in the health outcomes. In this particular paper, we are focusing on the educational outcomes. Right now, we have already started with another paper where we are doing differences in the health outcomes, and we are trying to find out competing explanations for that as well. But in this particular paper, we are trying to say that it's not just the son preference, but there could be other possible explanations which are bringing in gender gaps in education. And for those competing explanations, we are focusing only on the demand side factors. We are not focusing on the supply side factors. And as I mentioned, that all these demand side factors have been clubbed together into one big umbrella term, which is the strong son preference, which leads to the alteration in the sex composition of the children, and which actually makes certain girls not to born in the society, which leads to a very famous concept of saints, or Amartya Sen concept of missing women, that yes, some of the women or some of the girls are missing from the society. In our paper, we are focusing on the women who are non-missing. Non-missing simply means that these are the girls who are allowed to be born, and they're surviving in the society where son preference is very much prevalent. Because if there was very strong son preference, then these women would not have been allowed to born. But since these women are there in the society, they have been allowed to be born. So there must be some other competing explanations that why there is gender gap in education which is coming in. And to explain those motivations, or to explain those different reasons that why there are gender gaps in education, we highlight some of the parental motivations, that why parents invest less in the girls' education or more in the boys' education. And on the basis of those different parental motivations, we have different types of parents that may be there in the society. So the first type of the parent, or the first type of explanation, is something that we all know is like a Beccarian taste for discrimination against girls, which is literally the strong son preference, where the parents believe that girls are somewhat inferior, or there is a male superiority, or sons are the caretaker of the family, they have to carry the name of the family, and girls, they actually discriminate against the girls, and they don't allow the girls to be born. And if the girls are being born, then they don't invest in their girls' education, or they invest less in their daughters compared to their sons. So that's one extreme form of families, or one extreme form of motivation, where the parents do practice taste for discrimination, or parents do have strong son preference. But this is one extreme form, which is usually we call which everyone usually call to be the strong son preference, but it's really the taste for discrimination that parents have against the girl child. And we all we say that whatever the gender gaps are there, either in health or in education, it's all because of taste for discrimination. But that may not be the case. So what could be the other explanations? So this brings us to the other explanation, which is the explanation given by Seema Jayachandra, which is about the meta son preference. Now, what this meta son preference is all about? So this says that parents may not have any intrinsic taste for discrimination against girls, or they may not prefer sons over daughters, but it's just that they have some desired number of sons in their mind, or you can say that they want to have at least one son in the family, probably to carry the name of the family forward, or probably the son is there to take old age care of the parents, or probably there are certain rituals which are being performed only by the sons and not by the daughters. So parents have this thing in mind that they should have at least one son in the family, or probably some desired number of sons. So in this process, they have something what is called a sex selective fertility stopping rule. So till they are not going to have those desired number of sons, they are continuing to have babies. Once they have those desired number of sons, they'll stop their fertility decisions. So in this process of getting add to that desired number of sons, parents end up giving birth to the babies, and in this process they have certain daughters as well whom they thought that they should not have been born, or if they are being born, so there is no problem. They do not discriminate if the girls are being born. It's just that they wanted certain number of sons to be born in the family. So all these daughters are somewhat we call as unwanted daughters. And why we call them unwanted daughters? Because in the process of trying for a son, they end up having daughters, and this process actually distort their desired number of children that they want to have in a family. They have only the desired number of sons in their mind and not the desired numbers of children. So there is a difference between these two things. So when they have more children than what they have decided, so obviously per capita resource availability for every child is less. And rather than investing less in the son's education or health outcomes, they prefer to invest less in the daughter's education, or it will lead to lower investment in the unwanted daughters. So this is something what is called as meta-son preference. The third type of motivation which is leading to gender gaps is resource concentration. Now, this resource concentration is actually a concept which is opposite to a sociological concept known as resource dilution hypothesis. Now, what this hypothesis says is that whatever resources you consider in a family, being it time, being it effort, being it money, or whatever resources a family has, those resources are limited, and hence parents prefer to spend those resources on the child who is most likely to succeed. So again, parents do not have any intrinsic taste for discrimination for these against daughters or any son preference. It's just as parents do not want to dilute their resources by spreading evenly across all the children, and hence they prefer to concentrate their resources on the child who is most likely to succeed. And in obviously patriarchal society or in a male dominated society, it's the child who is most likely to succeed is usually the sons, and hence they end up doing greater investment in the sons in the form of providing them better quality education, or spending more on the sons education, or the health outcomes. So this is like a rational decision which the parents are taking, that okay, if we have to spend resources, it's better to spend the resources on the child who is going to be the future of the family. The fourth type or parental motivation is something which has nothing to do with the son preference. So there is no intrinsic bias, no unequal treatment, no gender bias, and these are the families which we usually call as the egalitarian families, where they'll spend equal resources amongst both sons and daughters. So irrespective of whether they have sons or irrespective of whether they have daughters, they will spend equally. So this fourth type is really the most egalitarian families who are there in the society. Now the question is that how these four different motivations of the parents, one extreme is your taste for discrimination and another extreme is your egalitarian society, how are we actually going to identify these motivations when we are working with the survey data, or how are we going to identify these family types? So this is one, you can say, a drawback with the observational data or with the survey data, that if you go and ask to the parents that do you really want to have a girl, or is this girl is someone whom you wanted to have, or is this girl an unwanted girl, obviously they won't reveal that fact. They'll always say a politically correct answer, oh no, this is our child, this is our baby, this is our daughter, we are going to spend money on her, so there is no problem in that. So this is the biggest problem in the observational studies, that people don't reveal their desire for the sons. And even if they go for prenatal sex determination or sex selective abortions, all these are illegal activities, but they are still thriving in the Indian society. But they won't reveal all these things. But parents do consciously manipulate the size and the sex composition of their families. So what we do in our paper, we focus only on the families which have 3 or more children. And why do we focus on these families? It's something that I'll come in the next slide. But given the sex composition of the children in the family, we have 3 different types of families. One family is a family which has only girl children. So all the children are girls in the family. Second family is a family where all the children are boys. And third is a family where there is a mix of both girls and boys are there in a family. And to identify whether any of these families have unwanted girls, that is in the hope of having a son, parents are continuing to have children, and some of the girls are parents do not want to have. So we need to identify who are these unwanted girls. So to identify these unwanted girls, what we did, that we divide the mixed families, because there are 3 types of families. We focus only on mixed families, and we divide these families into 2 groups: families having unwanted girls and families having girls who may not be considered as unwanted. How we did that? Now, this is something which is important to understand because this identification of unwanted girls is something, the main contribution of our paper. So who is an unwanted girl? So if the parents are having children, if the last child is a boy and all the girls preceding to that boy, all the children who are born preceding to that boy child are girls, then all the girls from the second birth order to n-1th birth order, all those are unwanted. So it's like if you have 3 children in a family, first 2 are girls and the third is a boy. So that means the family stop after this third boy child. So this second daughter is considered to be an unwanted girl. First daughter, we are not calling her to be an unwanted girl, because usually the first son, the gender of the first girl or the first child is exogenous factor. We can assume that, or if parents are not going for any kind of prenatal sex determination or any kind of family planning measures for the first child, it's usually for the second child that they go for all these things. And I have various things as robustness checks or as selectivity concerns that I have in later in my slides. But why we call this girl child to be an unwanted girl? Because of 2 reasons. First, that parents actually go for a second child when the first child was a girl. Secondly, the parents stopped their fertility after a boy is being born, which clearly indicates that any girl who is born from this second birth order to say any order before this boy child is being born, that's an unwanted girl. And we call such families as mixed families with unwanted girls. So the first girl child may be also an unwanted girl, but we are not calling her to be an unwanted. It's the second daughter, third daughter, and so forth till the last but one-th daughter. That's the unwanted. That's what unwanted girls by our explanation. And we call these families as families, mixed families with unwanted girls. The all other families where they're mixed families, where they have both boys and girls in whichever order they are coming, those are mixed families with no unwanted girls. So by this explanation, we have 4 types of families: only girls families, only boys families, mixed families with unwanted girls, and mixed families with no unwanted girls, which we simply call them as mixed families. And on the basis of this exposition, we have 6 types of children in our data set: girls in only girls families, boys in only boys families, girls and boys in the mixed families with unwanted girls, which we simply represent by G unwanted and B unwanted, and boys and girls with mixed families with no unwanted girls, which we represent by G mix and B mix. Now the question is that this explanation or this creation of unwanted girls, this may not be a correct formation. And here we mention, it's important to mention a caveat of a study, that whatever number of unwanted girls we are finding in our paper, that is actually a lower bound estimate. There could be many unwanted girls in the society, but in our exposition or in our explanation, we are not considering all the girls to be unwanted, mainly because of the fact that in a survey data or in an observational data, it's difficult to determine with precision whether a girl is wanted or unwanted. Parents won't reveal that. So what we actually observe is the exposed number of children, or the children who are actually there in a family. We cannot observe the ex ante desires of parent of how many daughters or how many sons sons the parents want to have. That is something which is not possible. So we only have the exposed number of children, and this exposed number of children, and whether they are sons or the daughters or whatever is the gender mix of these children, that is a function of many factors, including the what desired family size parents want to have, whether they practice any kind of son preference or not, what degree of son preference they have, or it could be just sheer luck that the parents have. Whatever category of this unwanted girls that we have, it's actually giving a lower bound, because it could be the case that most of the only girls families, the families where there are only girls, most of the girls in that family are also unwanted, and parents would have wanted to go for another child and have a boy. They may have been trying for a boy but never got one, and hence they stopped at some point. So it could be the case that most of these only girls families have girls who are unwanted. And similarly, there could be parents who have only two children, one girl and one boy, when they wanted to have both to be the sons. But probably the desired number of children could be more prominent reason than desired number of sons, and hence they do not want to go for the third child. So it could be the case that many of the two-child families whom we have not considered in our analysis, they may also have unwanted girls. But in our classification and our explanation, since we are focusing only on three or more families with three or more children, whatever number of unwanted girls we are finding, that's a lower bound. That's not an upper bound, or there would be many more unwanted girls in the society. So now the next big questions that come up is how we are linking these parental motivations like meta-son preference or resource concentration to the family types that we have. And to explain that, if we want to test that whether in the society parents are practicing strong son preference, that means yes, they have the Beckerian taste for discrimination or they do not prefer to invest in girls' education. If we simply compare the outcomes of only girls' families with only boys' families, this comparison will actually reveal that whether there is strong son preference in the society or not. If we want to test for the presence of meta-son preference, that means families are having daughters in the hope of a son. If we want to know whether the parents are practicing meta-son preference or not, we simply compare the outcomes of girls and boys in the mixed families with unwanted girls. So if we compare the outcomes of girls in unwanted families and boys with unwanted families, that's the simple explanation of meta-son preference. And for the resource concentration mechanism, that the parents are concentrating their resources on the child who is most likely to succeed. If we compare the outcomes of girls and boys in the families with no unwanted girls, mixed families with no unwanted girls, then it's a simple test of presence of resource concentration. Now, how we did all these things. So we focus on the NSS data, National Sample Survey data, and we focus only on the special education survey rounds. Now, till date, NSS has 5 rounds, but we focus only on the 4 rounds. 2007-8 round, which is NSS 68th round, it's an outlier compared to all other 4 rounds, so we decided not to use that round, but we are using these 4 rounds, and we have pooled these cross sections together, and whatever analysis we'll do, it will be on pooled cross-sectional data. For our analysis, we focus on the families having 3 or more children, but all these children are biological children, and to identify biological children in a family, in the NSS data, we can only identify these biological children to the head of the household. So there could be a joint family setup where there are 3 or more, 2 or more brothers living together in a household. But with NSS data, it's difficult to identify who is the child of whom. The only possible way that we can identify biological children is only through the head of the household. So we focus on the head of the household and his or her children. For the identification of the child type and family type, we focus on all biological children, but for the analysis of the gender gaps, we focus only on the children who are in the age group of 6 to 19 years. So there could be a possibility that in a family, there is a child of 3 years of age. So suppose there is a son of 3 years of age and all other children are girls who are elder to him and they are in the age group of 16 to 19 years. So since there are all girls and there is one boy who is the last boy, so that family will be like a mixed family with unwanted girl. But that son is not counted in finding the gender gaps in education, because obviously he's just a 3-year-old child. No expenditure on education would have been done till that time. So identification of child type and family type, we use all biological children, but for gender gaps in education, we use only the children who are in the age group of 6 to 19 years. What are the outcome variables that we are looking at? So obviously we are looking at education gaps. So we have divided all these education variables into two types. One is the quantity of education variables, and other is the quality of education variables. So for the quantity of education variables, we have these three variables: whether the child was ever enrolled to any school, and since it's a dichotomous variable, we use a probit estimation. Second, if the child was ever enrolled to a school, is the child currently going to a school or not? Because as I mentioned earlier, that there could be all possible reasons that a child may drop out from a school. So this currently enrolled thing is like one of the indicator of dropout rate. So again, it's estimated using a probit estimation. Then the level of education that the child has attained, and to capture that level of education, we use the years of education, and it's a continuous variable. We use OLS. For the quality of schooling variables, again, we have three variables over here. One is whether the child is enrolled in a private school. Second, whether the child is enrolled in an English medium school compared to any vernacular language school, or the combination of these two variables, whether the child is enrolled to a private English medium school or the government vernacular language school. And why we use these to be the quality variables? Because again, there is a huge amount of literature which actually documents that private schools, since they are fee-based schools, they are more accountable to the parents to provide quality education services to the students compared to the government schools. And these private schools usually emerge in the places where the government schools have failed to provide good quality education to the students. Similarly, there is a literature which documents that the return to the English language schooling is higher in the labor market compared to the vernacular language schooling. So that's why we consider these two as the quality variables. Another variable that we focus on is the expenditure on education. And usually, since it's a continuous variable, people will think that it's better to use OLS, but that's not the case. And that's what something which has been discussed earlier in the morning as well, that this education expenditure may have certain selectivity concerns, because this education expenditure is only observed for the students who are currently going to the schools. Any child who is not going to the school, we cannot observe this education expenditure. So we use Heckman two-step selection procedure to figure out whether there are any gender gaps in education expenditure. Because again, there is a literature which documents that once the girls are there in school, they have special needs which are related to travel or clothing, and hence they parents end up spending more on the girl child rather than a boy child. So it's really not the gap which is observed in the education expenditure, it's the gap which is enrolled in the first stage, that is the current enrollment stage. So you can say these are the three different categories that we are looking at for our for studying gender gaps in education. How we did this estimation? So we do two type of estimations. One is finding out the overall gender gaps, or if there are any differences between girl child and boy child, irrespective of in which family they are. So this is like a simple regression equation, and depending upon which outcome variable we are taking, whether years of education, then it's OLS, or if it's current enrollment, that it's a probit estimation. So depending upon whatever our outcome variable is, that's our dependent variable. On the independent side, we have the female dummy, which is simply giving us the difference between the girls and the boys. The round dummy, which is our ear dummy. And this third term is the interaction term, which is giving us the difference in difference estimator, showing the changes over time. Sorry.
Your time is also running short.
Okay. I'll make sure that. How much time do I have, by the way? Hello?
You have exceeded it already.
But we
Oh,
can use 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Let us say 4 minutes now because.
okay. Then I go over it a little quickly. So this is really the difference in difference estimator, which is showing the change which is happening over time between difference between girls and boys. And this xi is all the set of control variables. This is the first set of regression. In the second set of regression, where we are actually finding out whether there is strong son preference or meta son preference, what we have, we replace that female dummy with the child type dummy. So we have these 6 child types, and this again the interaction term is showing us the differences which are there over time across these different child types. And as I mentioned earlier, to figure it out whether it's a strong son preference, we compare the outcome of only girls with only boys. For meta son preference, we have girls in unwanted and compare the outcome of girls and boys in unwanted families. And for the resource concentration, we have girls and boys in the mixed families. So these are some descriptive statistics. So let me just skip and directly move on to my estimation results. So for the overall gender gaps for the quantity of education, what we find is that over time, the probability of ever enrollment, current enrollment, years of education, the quantity differences have been completely eliminated between girls and boys. But the quality variables, the gender gaps in quality variables, it has increased over time, or if they have reduced, then they have become insignificant, but they still exist. If we consider the discrimination part, or the terms of taste for discrimination, methods and preference and resource concentration, for the quantity variables, again, we find that over time, the gaps are reducing, but for the quality of education, the gaps are still very much prevalent, and the gaps are largest in the families which have unwanted girls. So it's really the intensification of meta-son preference that has adversely affected the schooling of the unwanted girls. It's not the strong son preference, which we usually consider to be the main reason for observing gender gaps in education. So I have certain robustness and selectivity concerns. I don't know whether I have time to go over this or not, but I'm just mentioning it very quickly, that why we focus on families having 3 children or more, mainly because of the fact that one child families are now appearing to be an egalitarian family, but the 2C families, they at the outside, they appear to be egalitarian families, but in our analysis, because we have done analysis on 1C and 2C families as well, in our analysis, what we find that no, they are not. They do have deep-rooted son preferences, which can't be observed at the outset. But if we go deeper into the analysis, we definitely observe that, and hence it's important. It's good to focus on families having 3 children or more. Whether there will be any issues regarding the stability of family types, as I mentioned, that they may change their types, that they may end up becoming a mixed family, or they may end up becoming an unwanted family. So we perform various robustness checks, and we find that our results are robust to all those things. Then this is another exercise that we did, that whether parents can explicitly express their son preference or not. So in NSS data, it's not possible to. So we switch to NFHS data, and there we find that yes, parents do reveal that they have a preference for the son, especially when they have unwanted daughters in a family. And I think I should stop over here, but okay, this is the last thing that we did, that we use the birth spacing as a measure to figure out whether families do practice meta-son preference or not. And we realized that yes, families do go for terminated pregnancies, or they do use family planning measures when a boy child is born than when a girl child is born. And these are some discussions regarding the norms that are being changing in the society away from the strong son preference, or away from the old-fashioned discrimination that girls are being considered as pariah dhan, or it's like if you're investing in the girls' education, it's a waste of a resource. People are moving from that part to a new norm where girls are becoming a caretaker in the old age of their families, and mainly because of the fact that there are certain schemes of the government as well which are changing the mindset, or you can say marriage market is also playing an important role over there, where the education of there is certain minimum level of education that the girls are having to enter into the marriage market. So with this, I actually end that there are gender gaps in education which are not totally due to strong son preference. It's the meta son preference which is the most important reason, or the most prevalent reason, followed by resource concentration. And then I have all the estimation results. I think I should end over here.
Thanks, Apurva, for bringing out this empirical estimation of the differences between the problems of strong sun preference and meta sun preference. May I quickly request Meenakshi Sharma to make observations on your paper.
Yeah, am I?
Yeah, yes, Meenakshi, the video is not on. Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you to Dr. Gupta for making giving such a nice paper, which is giving a insight about the gender bias, and especially when in her paper she has used the family structure to analyze the issue of gender bias. And I think when we are talking about the issue of gender bias, the same analogy we can draw when we were talking about the population growth is a problem for most of the developing countries. Is it an attitudinal problem or it is a development problem? So in India and China, like, the high population is a problem because the people are ignorant. They don't understand the problem of, the big family size. Or is it a development problem? Like if you provide them as we develop, if you give them a higher insurance, if there are a possibility of insurance, so they might plan a lower number of children. The same thing, I think, in your paper, you are trying a very important issue of gender bias. You are trying to capture whether it is a attitudinal problem, whether it is a discrimination against a female child, which is an inherent bias, or is it a resource concentration? Resource concentration, I mean, is it an optimal response to a given condition? And then you have drawn different categories. You have drawn that we have a families with only girls, we have a families with only boys, we have a families with both girls and boys. And in the third group, if I'm not wrong, you have further subdivided into subcategory, the families with the meta-son preferences and where the girls are considered unwanted girls, and the families with mixed families where the girls are unwanted. Now, and then you have associated under each category the reason that this is the category we are considering. This is the resource concentration may be the reason. If this is the category, there is a inherent bias against girl is the reason. Now, I have one question which I couldn't understand, which maybe you can explain me. And the question is that suppose I consider categories and which you have done, families with only boys and the families with only girls. And I think you have compared the educational outcomes for the families with only girls vis-a-vis the families with only boys. And if it is low, because you have used that estimation, keeping all the other factors constant. If the estimation is low, it is because of the discrimination. So I'm saying here, when you are making a category, this can also be because of the factor other than discrimination. For example, I'm a person, and I'm a person who is keeping a certain amount of money for my certain amount of money that I'm going to decide that this is the amount of money I'm going to keep for my old age, and this is the amount of money I'm going to keep for education. So when I see the boys are born, I am going to keep less for my old age and I'm keeping more for their education. When I'm seeing girls are born, I am keeping more on the old age as a source of pension and less on the girls' education. So is it a discrimination? I think this is not a discrimination. This is like my optimal choice. I mean, I'm behaving as an optimizer rather than discriminating. So not necessarily. My first point. See, your methodology is really superior because you're using a family structure where you are making categories. But my problem is when you are making category, in each category, all the fits are possible, which you failed. Which I think this paper failed precisely here. My point number one. Again, I repeat, in girls and girls, if you're comparing the educational outcome for girls and girls vis-a-vis the families with boys and boys, it may not be because I have an inherent preference for boys. It could be like it is coming from my being an economist. Being like, maybe if I can use a better word, like I can use like optimizer. सो बॉयज है, सो बॉयज के लिए एजुकेशन पे पैसा ज्यादा जाएगा और ओल्ड एज पेंशन पे कम. गर्ल्स है तो गर्ल्स के लिए डाउरी पे ज्यादा पैसा जाएगा और एजुकेशन पे कम. सो दिस इज माय एक्ट एज एन ऑप्टिमाइजर, नॉट नेसेसरली माय एक्ट एज अ इनहेरेंट डिस्क्रिमिनेशन अगेंस्ट गर्ल्स. Point number 1. Point number 2. If I look at the situation, mixed families, not with GGBs. When you are saying GGBs, clearly understood your point. Even in GGBs, suppose I guess what you are saying GGBs, where you are referring it to meta-son preference, the desire for at least one single son. I'm talking about under the mixed category, the second point. The second category where the girls are wanted. So there, your argument is that there is the factor could be resource concentration. I'm saying look at this kind of a format. I have a boy, then I have a girl, then I have a girl, and I'm a person who is looking for two boys. So I have a pattern like boy, girl, girl, boy. Okay. So I have boy, I'm repeating again, I have a boy, girl, girl, boy. So when I have this pattern, even then, you cannot say that, it is just purely resource concentration. I'm not repeating the resource concentration because I hope it is clear to the audience. What is the resource concentration? That when you end up, but I'm saying when you have a pattern like BGGB, how will you differentiate that it is only because of the resource concentration and it is not because of the inherent preference for a son? So my point is that you neatly make the categories, but the basic flow of the paper that in each category, all the effects are present. So the estimation could be relatively, the argument becomes little muddy. If not, it becomes little weak. And I think you can never judge the preferences. It is so inherent. Even in the third category, GGB, whether it is because, see, my point is that what people is talking about that you are distangling the fact, whether it is because of the inherent discrimination against girls, or it is because of the resource concentration, or it is a meta-son preference. For that, you make the family structure, for that, you make categories. But while you are making categories, you fail to distangle the effect because one category can have all the effects which the data, which you are admitting. The data failed to capture, and I think little more. We can go for experiment like you can. It's just on a very lighter note. I don't know to which extent because I've never been a part of the experimental economics. You capture a girl child and then ask how much money you want to give. Kidnapping and all that kind of experiment has also happened. So that money can tell you, oh, okay. So I think that's where I consider the flaw in the paper, and that is the only point. Otherwise, it's a very interesting argument. It's an interesting point that you are coming up, the gender bias issue. And I think the research is really important to say that as we are, the economy is modernizing, the so-called modernization is happening in India. How much spending is actually being, spent on girls vis-a-vis the boys? But the family structure, I have a problem with the family structure to capture. Are you really able to clearly establish? Because your problem, your main problem was not to even say that, there's a preference for son over girls. You want to differentiate, which I just put it in the starting. Is it an attitudinal problem? It is a resource concentration problem, or it is a meta-son preference. Family structure in your paper appears to be not a very good criteria because each criteria can have many factors which the data, as you are admitting, fail to capture. I think I should stop here. If others have a question, they can also ask.
So I think possibly Apurva can answer the same or respond to it, and in between the others.
Yeah, or you can take the questions.
Yes, Apurva.
Yeah, it's better to take the questions and then respond to.
Yeah. Because the questions may be overlapping on that.
Yeah. Any more? Nobody is risen a hand. Ankit, is it the old time or is it the old question or you have another question, Ankit?
No, sir, no question.
No, because your hand is still, then you can just, yeah. Anybody else? Anybody from the students also? I think Meenakshi has given a lot for you to answer. So, okay. I think you can respond to it because
No, actually, the problem is that,
it's
hello?
very interesting a query which has been raised also. Anyway, let us hear.
No, actually, this is the biggest thing which we have mentioned in our paper, that it's more of figuring out whether it's an attitudinal problem or it's a rational decision which parents are taking. And this is with what we started our paper, and this is what we ended our paper with, that we are just trying to figure out why everything which is considered to be an attitudinal problem and then everything is being clubbed together into some preference. This is something that what we are actually arguing, that it's not an attitudinal problem, or it may not be, everything may not be sun preference, it could be the rational decision of the parents as well. So that's what we are actually arguing in our paper, that meta sun preference or the resource concentration is actually the rational decisions that the parents are taking. And about the family structure that you are talking about, that it could be like B, G, G, B, or the girl, boy, girl. So that is again a caveat that I have mentioned in my slides as well, and it's actually being explained in a greater detail in the paper, that all these family structure is just the observational data that we have in our hand. We cannot observe their explicit sun preference. So for knowing their explicit sun preference, so let me tell you what we have done in our paper is that we have gone to NFHS data, and in NFHS data we have made exactly the similar categories of mixed families with unwanted girls, mixed families with no unwanted girls, or only girls and only boys families. And in NFHS data they ask precise questions, that if you could go back in the history and figure out how many sons and daughters you would like to have, how many will they be? So will you prefer more number of sons or will you prefer less number of sons? And the questions like, if you go for another child, would you prefer that child to be a boy or to be a girl? So all these questions are there in NFHS, and we have studied those questions, and what we realize that there is actually son preference across all family types. But where it is relatively more, it was relatively more in the families having unwanted girls, or the mixed families having unwanted girls. And as I have mentioned, that there could be other issues as well which we are unable to figure it out, mainly because we are having the observation data. As I have mentioned, that only girls families could be mixed families, or only girls families could be unwanted families. So that is definitely a problem. And when it comes to that, with development, things are changing. And again the answer is yes, the things are changing, and that was again there in one of my slides which I couldn't present, but again it's explained in greater detail in the paper, that whether it's the old fashioned discriminations or parents are using all these gender gaps, or you can, or sorry.
Yeah, I'm saying, is
Okay.
it like an optimal response to a given
uh,
condition, which you are
yes, yes,
saying,
yes.
which you're talking about the resource concentration?
Yeah.
Which I have given so-called another name, which you are putting it, as you change the condition. So whether the conditions are changing, because when you are talking about the GGGB, GGBs, so it is like that they are not unwanted, but just because that the more girls are being born, so to be more rational. Right.
Exactly. That's what I started with.
The son will carry the name of the family forward, and because of the other reason. So I'm getting it. My only problem is that which category. I'm getting all that. My only issue is that because you try to distangle, because your paper start that we are trying to distangle through family structure. I think that distangling could not be carried out properly because of the inappropriate way of making categories. It could be done in a little more refined way, because the factors within each category are mixing a lot. No one,
Okay.
not even, you're getting my point. So when we are talking about preferences, they are so inherent. Forget about the data. If I'm going for a second child, I may not reveal to my husband what actually. So the preferences are so inherent. Family structure may not be in an appropriate way
to capture these rational decisions or the attitudinal decisions.
It is
Okay,
very
okay.
inherent. That's my
So, any suggestion that you would like to give on how we can disentangle all these effects that we have mentioned in the paper? Any other better way that you can suggest? Probably we should definitely try out those ways.
Yeah, that we will have to look into. Might be, we should now, for the time being, I think we should go forward to the next paper because already we have crossed the limit and of this particular paper. We have another third paper. The other session people have also come. So let us have the third paper now. Thanks to Dr. Apurva as well as to Meenakshi Sharma and also to the rapporteurs of this particular session, Ambika and Ranveer and Ayushi and Abhivekti. Thank you so much. Over to the next speaker, Harshil Kaur. In this session, we have one more speaker in this particular session, after which we will go to the next session. So, Harshil, I think you should have 15 minutes. Please finish it off in 15 minutes, after which we will have a discussion by Amit Jha. Over to Harshil Kaur. She is presenting on economic approaches to law, understanding torts and liabilities. Yes. Yes. Over to you, Harshil. I think you have to unmute. Harshil, you have to unmute. I'm not at hearing you. Can you unmute? Others are hearing you. Meenakshi, are you able to hear her?
She isn't audible.
Yeah. We are not able to hear you. I don't know why. No. We are not able to hear you, I think.
Ma'am, please try to rejoin. Maybe there's
So maybe she can rejoin. Generally, that's it.
Yes.
Yeah, if you rejoin, it will be fine, is what they're saying.
Sir, you are the only occupant in the class right now. You are sitting in 101?
I am sitting in 102.
Achha,
Because it's the only place where there is a clock.
Okay.
Yes, Harshil, can you speak now? Let us see. No, not yet. I do not know whether it is because... Have you clicked on the audio on? Volume or something?
Ma'am, can you please detach your earphones and then speak once? Maybe there's some problem with the earphones.
Hello. Let's try for a minute or so.
Am I audible now?
Yes. Yeah. Welcome, Harshil. Yeah, you can take 15 minutes. After anyway, I think the next session will have to be little bit. Yeah, let us anyway now do like that because it would require at least 10 to 15 minutes. After which Amit Jha will make a comment on your paper. Okay.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, sir, especially Krishna, sir, and giving me this opportunity to present my research work in front of all these esteemed scholars and researchers. So I would like to present my
Screen.
Yeah, is this visible?
Not yet. You can click on the present now on this side that is towards the right below. Yeah.
Yeah.
Click, there's an arrow which goes up. Yeah, it's visible now.
Okay, so I'm here to present my paper on the economic approach to law, understanding tort liability, and I've tried to keep it very simple without going into much technical terms and the methodology, because as this is for undergrad students, and I'm very thrilled that University of Delhi will actually be offering this paper as an optional paper for our third year students, the law and economics. And though we studied it in our second year of masters, but it's such a relatively new area of study, and there is so much to explore in this area. So I'm happy to introduce this discipline of law and economics in front of everyone, and then give a brief insight about my research, what I have done. So basically, before this would be the outline. I'll be introducing the discipline of law and economics, then specially focusing on the tort laws, followed by the liability rules, and then decoupled liability, a bit of my research and the results which we have got in our paper. So before going into the theoretical framework, the specificities of these discipline, law and economics, I would like to share this very interesting case which actually came up in 2012 in front of Competition Commission of India. So there is this Ajay Devgan films versus Yash Raj films, and what actually Ajay Devgan films sued Yash Raj films for signing some kind of agreements with the single screen theater owners. And what Yashraj film was actually doing, that they were going to release one of their movies, Ek Tha Tiger, in August, and they wanted an agreement with these the theater owners that they will also exhibit their next film, which was going to release in December. So what Ajay Devgan films did was they sued Yash Raj films for this kind of contract with the single theater owners, saying that Yash Raj films, they are engaging in exploitative practices, they are creating barriers to entry for them, because Ajay Devgan was also to release his film in the coming December, and creating so Yash Raj films was actually doing some kind of exploitative practices in the film industry and actually abusing their dominant position in that industry. So this CCI, the Competition Commission of India, when they looked into this matter, they considered what kind of dominant position Yash Raj films have, what is their vertical integration, what are the sources with them and all, and in fact gave a verdict to the in favor of Yash Raj films. Now, why I started off with this interesting case is because as I just moved on with the case, and when you just listened to this, you must have considered and thought of that I took the terms which were describing this particular case, especially the dominant position, the competition, or the vertical integration. These are the terms which we generally use in economic parlance. So even if we are studying a legal case, we are actually going back to our economic theory and analyzing the case from that lens. And this is what the discipline of law and economics actually does. So it gives us this framework, it gives us this kind of methodology to analyze the law practices which we consider, and to analyze the law practices through the lens of economics. So this is what the beauty of this approach, the law and economics is. So this is application of economic theory and methods to the practice of law. In fact, what it actually assumes, this theory actually assumes that people, they are very rational and they actually respond to the legal sanctions rationally, and they view these legal sanctions as the prices to their behavior. So we can set these prices to guide their behavior in a socially desirable direction, you know. So be it when we fix the fines for violation of traffic rules, or when we fix the charges for a criminal case, or we fix the benefits for a whistleblower, or the compensation paid to the victim. So these are the prices for their behavior. And economic theory, or the approach of this law and economics, it assumes that we can fix these prices and, you know, regulate the behavior of the rational individuals in a socially desirable manner. So when we analyze this legal system with the help of our with the help of our economics theory, we basically have two kinds of analysis. So the first one is the positive analysis, where we assume that legal rules are efficient. So it has this implicitly assumption imbibed in this analysis that the whatever legal rules are formed, they do reflect the social objective of efficiency. And while the later on there is another kind of analysis which is the normative analysis, which asserts that legal rules should be efficient. So there is a difference between these two analyses, but at times we intermingle them also. But as you have just noticed, when I talk about the analysis, they are focusing on the term efficient. Now, a very important question which arises is that, does this efficiency is the sole criteria to evaluate laws? So does the court, when they actually you know, view a case or they give some verdict, should they focus on this efficiency, or the critiques, like, they argue that they should focus on more on fairness and justice rather than, you know, focusing on efficiency? But when this discipline of law and economics was started off there, so then it was actually a debate went on. So, and they were like that that the terms which I've just used, the justice and the fairness, they are very vague terms. So we can't actually give them a theoretical framework. And efficiency is actually one term which have a very common thread with the justice also, and with fairness also, because efficiency is actually concerned with the distribution of wealth in the society with the minimum you know, sacrifice of resources. So efficiency is in a way connected to justice also, and efficiency is of course a more concrete term. So we do you know, emphasize on efficiency in our discipline of law and economics. And the two main concepts of efficiency which are commonly used in the discipline of law and economics are the Pareto efficiency and the Calder-Hicks efficiency. So we all know about a Pareto efficient allocation, where no one can be made better off without making anyone else worse off. On the other hand, Calder-Hicks efficiency says that theoretically, if we can compensate the losers from the gains of the gainers, so that is more efficient. So I'm not going into the technical parts, but these are the two concepts of efficiency which are used in the discipline of law and economics. Now, there are many areas of study under law and economics, or we can say that under the sub-discipline of law and economics. So the first is the property law, which says that the property rights should be clearly defined beforehand. Though we have an important result over here given by Coase, which states that if the transaction costs are negligible and bargaining is possible, then irrespective of where the property rights are initially assigned, the resources will be efficiently utilized. But we know that in the real world, this does not happen, and transaction costs are actually high. And we do face the problem of the tragedy of commons, in fact. So property law states that the property rights should be clearly defined. Then the other area of study is the contract law. So contract law also states that the contracts should be well written, and courts should also, encourage the firms to engage in written contracts and adhere to them. But we know that there is always a time lag between the formation of contracts and their execution. And in between that time lag, there can be intense problems like distrust or incomplete contracts. So contract law actually serves as a redressal mechanism or a solution system where these contracts are not obliged to. So contract law also kind of evaluate these laws with the economic efficiency. And the third area of study is given by the criminal law. And we have seen that most of the empirical work is done in this criminal law, maybe because of the availability of data and all. And what is asserted here is that whenever there would be an increase in the probability and the severity of the punishment, it will lead to reduced levels of crime. So actually criminals also respond to fines and incentives like any other rational individual. So these are the three areas. I'm not going into detail, but anyone who is interested, we can discuss it later on. My main area of study would be the tort laws. And tort laws, they basically covers violations where one person's action causes injury or loss to another person. So you can think of a negative externality over here, where one person's activity is basically causing, an accidental loss, and the other person is bearing that loss. So tort law covers this area of violation. So again, just to give one example or one case of tort laws in India, in 2003, there was this Upar cinema tragedy in which fire broke up, and there were hundreds of people who lost their lives and were injured. So when this was taken to the court, the owners of the cinema, they were held responsible and liable, and then they were asked to compensate the victims. The amount was initially, the Delhi High Court announced 25 crores, but later on it was slashed also. So this is these tort laws are mainly concerned with this liability of the injurer, of the person whose action is causing injury to the other people. So the tort laws, basically, they serve two purposes. Like I said, first, to compensate the victims for any loss caused by the injurer's violation, and then second is to deter the injurer from repeating such violation in the future. Because again, in this Upar tragedy case also, so 25 crores were given as compensation, and then courts decided that they will also pay around 25 lakhs as punitive damages. So punitive damages is the term which we use, where we say that the injurer should take it as a punishment that he will not engage in such kind of activities in the future, or will take care in the future. So this is how these tort laws basically work. And while assigning these liabilities among the interacting parties, tort laws, they address the following issues, like who would pay for the damage, on what basis the liability should be assigned, is the person actually liable or not, or was it the victim who should be held responsible, and he should be responsible for more of the loss. So what are the basis for that? What legal standards should be used to assign this kind of liability, to assign this kind of responsibility? So all these issues are covered under tort laws. So in fact, liability rules are the formal constructs, which determine the share of loss to be borne by the two parties in case an accident occurs. So they are the they are the functions of in mathematics, when we say they are the functions which maps from the people behavior to the share of loss that should be borne by them. And these liability rules, they actually assign these liabilities based on the degrees of negligence. So courts, when they often decide on cases, they have this kind of benchmark care level, uh, which is decided priorly. So they see that whether the parties, they were actually taking that care level or not, and based on that benchmark, or
Only 20 minutes more, only 4 minutes more. Yeah.
yeah, so based on those uh, benchmarks, the courts decide whether the party is negligent or not, and then they assign the liabilities to the parties. So there are common liability rules which are studied in literature, like the strict liability, in which the injurer is always liable for the entire loss, and no liability, and so on. Now, a very important aspect of this liability is that it can be coupled if the assignment is said to be coupled if and only if the interacting parties, they together are made to bear the full loss, and it is said to be decoupled if and only if the interacting parties together bear less or more than the loss. So how it can be decoupled is like, suppose the injurer is bankrupt or is insolvent, so and the courts decide that the victim should be compensated, so they can compensate the victim out of some other special fund which is created for the compensation. So in this scenario, the liabilities would be decoupled. As you can see, the parties, they are together not bearing the full loss. The third party is involved. The victim compensation fund is involved. So there is a long debate on this decoupled liability, where there are two papers, one by Shavel and one by Jain. On one hand, Shavel says that decoupled liability will result in efficient outcomes. On the other hand, Jain makes a contrary claim, and he states that no, decoupled liability would be inconsistent with efficiency. And here is where my research, which I have co-authored with my supervisor, Dr. Rajendra Prasad Kundu, it fits in and it contributes to the literature of this assignment of liability. And when we look at this question, that is coupling necessary for efficiency, we look at a very general class of rules under which the liabilities are sometimes coupled and they are sometimes decoupled. And what we claim through our theoretical framework, through our methodology, is that decoupled liability can actually result in efficiency. So again, I'm not going into the technical part. The simple liability assignment rule is the one which we have used, and so uh, it's a game theory network where we find the conditions which are sufficient and necessary for efficiency of simple liability assignment rules. And if I can have 2 more minutes, I would just like to explain condition N3 and condition N4 over here, which states that whenever both the parties are negligent, then they can together bear no less than the entire loss. So the assignment can be decoupled here. And also for condition N4, where both the parties are non-negligent, then they together bear no more than the entire loss. So what we showed with the help of a game theory network, having conclusions based on Nash equilibrium, pure strategy Nash equilibrium. We used 6 propositions, and we then demonstrated that these conditions N1 to N4 are both sufficient and necessary for efficiency of simple liability assignment rule. So this is our conclusion based on our research, that decoupled liability is not inconsistent with the efficient care level. So thank you, everyone. I think in the given time frame, I've tried to give a brief of everything. So I hope I was.
Yeah, thank you so much. Over to Amit Jha for his quick comments. Amit Kumar
Yeah,
Jha.
hello everyone. Just got engaged in something. But the point is, Harshal, I didn't receive the whole of your papers. I just received 7 pages of yours.
Yeah.
So couldn't make much better observation. But again, there are certain things which I would like to know. But rather be a discussant, I would like to be the person who is going to raise queries with you.
Okay.
So why we suggest that this decoupling rules are always inefficient, and let's say we say that these they are efficient rules under which the liabilities are always coupled. Why we say like this?
So basically what Satish Jain he has done in his paper, he has taken a very restrictive class of rules which are known as liability rules, and which are very restrictive in the sense either they were always coupled or they were always decoupled. And with that restrictive set of rules, he has shown that decoupled liability would be inefficient. So we have gone a step further and we have taken a more general class of rules where we say that the liability can be coupled for some combinations and coupled for other combinations, and then we have set out the criteria or the conditions where we do find that we can have decoupled liability and still attain efficiency.
But again, the point is, if you would have sent me the whole paper, no, I would have read it.
Yeah, I will. I'll
Yeah.
surely.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned these simple liability assignment rules, right? Do you like to explore this into some when, let's say, when we are dealing with some complex liability assignment rules?
Yes, of course. In our paper, we have done analysis with simple liability assignment rules. And then we, of course, try to use this in our analysis and explore the possibility of decoupled liability in these set of rules also.
Okay. Anyway, but the only thing is what I couldn't have the papers of you.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Now we could not do much
Yeah.
about it.
Right.
I think we are also running short of time.
Right.
And thanks, Harshal Kaur, for the presentation which you made. Law and economics is also a very important frontier area of knowledge which is coming up. My only sort of problem with that stream of theorizing in law and economics is sometimes it actually becomes a highly optimizing exercise alone, whereas law and economics has much to do with the historical boundedness of the society and the evolution of institutions. So possibly there should be some interface between social historians of law as well as these theorists of law and economy, so that there would be more flesh to the skeleton of optimization exercises in this particular field. And thank you, Harshal, and thanks to everyone. Thanks to Pranav Sidwani, thanks to Purva Gupta, thanks also to Harshal, as well as our discussants, all the three of our discussants, Yogita, Meenakshi Sharma, and Amit Jha, and also the set of rapporteurs who had helped in rapporteuring this particular session and introducing. Thank you so much. Over to the next session. Yes.